Welcome to Before the Work Begins with me, Jo Hutton, senior yoga teacher and author of best-selling Substack Yoga for Tired People. And in this podcast, we speak to the movers, the shakers and the creatives and find out what they are doing before the work begins. Are they really getting up at 5 a.m. and taking cold plunges, or are they just trying to get by like the rest of us? I hope you enjoy. Today we are joined by the gorgeous Penny Wincer, and for people who at home who might not know exactly what you do, could you give us a little introduction, Penny?
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Jo. I am a writer. I am a writing coach. I am a parent to two teenagers. My eldest is disabled. You can probably hear I'm Australian, but I live in London. I've lived here for a very long time, almost 25 years, I think now. That's the kind of brief rundown on who I am.
And this is before the work begins, so we talk a little bit about mornings. Can you tell me what your morning looked like today?
Today, oh my goodness, you got me on a good day, Jo, because this morning was glorious. I woke up before my alarm and nobody woke me up before it. My son, who's 16, has very high needs, and every morning is different, shall we say. But this morning, he had a little bit of a sleep in. I got to wake up naturally before my alarm, but also not at 4 a.m, which was awesome. And I got up and I made myself a cup of tea and I took it back to bed, which is what I do whenever I possibly can. And then just had a really nice little bit of peace and quiet before I had to get up and start my day. But saying that, shall I compare it to yesterday morning?
Yeah.
You can
Always.
kind of variety that I might have. Yesterday morning, my son woke at 4:30 and basically was incredibly noisy and paced the house and made loads of noise, and I was unable to go back to sleep, and also he does require some supervision. So I ended up after about an hour realizing, there was no way I was even going to half doze through the noise and everything he was making. So I ended up getting up, getting my laptop out and editing something that I was working on. And then had to deal with multiple huge, enormous meltdowns, and then had to spend a bit of time, once I did finally get my son into school, had to spend quite a bit of time recovering from those meltdowns and also recovering the house from those meltdowns. And so didn't really get to kind of start my day, have some time alone or anything until about 10:30 in the morning. So that's just a little illustration about how different my mornings can be.
Do you have a particular relationship to mornings then, if they're different each time? Do you feel a certain way about a morning?
I am absolutely a morning person. 100%. I love mornings. I've always preferred the morning to the evening. But I think the thing is when you have somebody in your household that is very dependent on you and whose needs sort of, I guess, trump yours at any one time, is that you just have to become extremely flexible. Like, he is very rigid, so I have to be the flexible one. I was always, I guess, quite a sort of flexible person, for so many reasons. I've always been a creative freelancer, for instance, always. And so I've never had a kind of rigid Monday to Friday routine ever in my adult life. But having a son like mine has meant that I have to be flexible to the extreme. So even though I have my things that I really want and I really love and need, I have to be flexible about when those things happen. Because I think if you're caring for somebody else whose needs are so particular, if you become too fixated on getting things a certain way, getting things in a certain order, things happening a certain time, you will always be miserable. Like, you would just always be miserable. I think the only way to be really happy when you're caring for someone whose needs will always have to come first is by not holding on to things too tightly. I suppose that's probably the way of looking at it.
And did you have to change your identity around that and the way that you see yourself and your flexibility? Or was it just, you said you were quite flexible before, was it just a natural progression, or did you have to make like a conscious change in your identity around that?
I mean, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. I mean, I think I'm also the third child in the family. I feel like younger kids and families are probably also the ones that are kind of, because they're just like have to fit into the family when they arrive, right? So, in some ways, maybe I always had that role in my family. And my mum was really unwell when I was a teenager. I sort of had a childhood that was in a little bit of two halves. The first half of my childhood was very stable, very loving, very fixed. Everything was like super secure. And then the second half of my childhood, my mum was really unwell, mentally unwell, and was in and out of hospital a lot. And my parents were divorced, and we moved multiple times, and there was a lot of uncertainty. So I think I learned a lot of flexibility as well during that time. And then I went on to have a career that was also like required complete flexibility from me. I worked in photography for a really, really long time. I was an assistant first to fashion photographers, and then I became an interiors photographer myself. So I never had a corporate job or a, like a 9 to 5 or anything like that. It's funny in some ways that set me up really well for being a parent carer, in many ways, but at the same time, I sometimes look at my son and I think, oh, he probably could have done with a parent who was like, I don't know, a bit more of a tiger mum than me sometimes. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But in terms of the identity stuff, I think the thing that really was tricky for me was the freedom aspect. After being a young carer when I was a teenager, I sort of went very hard into my independence and freedom. I traveled a huge amount. I really have always enjoyed a lot of time on my own, for instance. I've always reveled in time alone. And so becoming a parent to a child who was never going to just grow out of needing support and needing help has been a really big mental challenge in terms of how I feel about my own independence. I can feel often very claustrophobic and feel like, that feeling of people needing me can make me feel like panicked sometimes. And I think part of that is because of my experience as a young carer when I was a teenager. So that has been the hardest thing to come to terms with, for sure.
But sometimes that freedom element that you get when if you've been a carer, like that is also a reaction thing. So it's not necessarily like a thing you've chosen yourself anyway. It's really difficult to unpick because this is true of anyone, isn't it? Whether they're a carer or not, we all live in community with people. Like it's always very difficult to unpick like what bits are my desires and which bits are a reaction or a result of the situation that I have been put in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly for young carers, if there's anyone listening who was in a young carer in any kind of form, and we don't really talk about young carers very much in our society because a lot of us are very uncomfortable with this idea that children have responsibility in their families. I didn't even understand that word when I was younger. In fact, I never heard the word when I was younger. I don't think hear that term until I was probably about 30, and I was like, oh my God, yeah, that's what I was. That was what I was doing. And in fact, actually, so I have another child and another teenager who's not disabled, who I also consider a young carer, not because they have responsibilities in this household towards their brother, they don't, but their whole life has been shaped by having a disabled sibling. Like in every possible aspect of our life has been affected by it. And I mean that in both good and bad ways. It's not a kind of, yeah, it's not all bad. These experiences that we have with when we're young in our families of origin, they do have huge impact on how we see the world and how we behave in the world. And I would say whenever I meet other people who have some kind of young caring, in their childhood, whether that be a sibling or a parent or whatever it is, I would say hyper independence is a pretty common theme amongst former young carers.
And I think that you're so right in that the society's just not geared up to understand it. And I think when you hear a lot of like the therapy speaking around it, and it's very like clear cut of like this is how you should feel and this is how you should behave, and what I thought was really lovely you said there about the good there too. And sometimes it's just not as simple as that. You like because this person is brings so much good as well. There's so much love there. It's so much more complicated than I think that people on the outside could understand, because nobody can understand what's going on inside a dynamic, can they?
Yeah, it's true. And in fact, actually, my teenager and I were discussing this the other day about some of the impact that this has had on them. And actually, we were laughing about how we just can't quite believe that some normal families, like we just sort of like they have not all of their friends, some of their friends have families with variety of different unusual challenges going on. It's not unusual to have challenges in a family. We were having a laugh about how we can't quite imagine having a life where there isn't just some quite major challenge that we're dealing with at all times. And it's funny, like I don't necessarily think of that as a bad thing, although there are some massive costs. There are huge costs to our family to, with what we're dealing with, but it's not all costs. I remember hearing someone once years ago, I can't even remember who it was, like a comedian or something, saying that, I think they'd just become a parent and they were like, well, I don't want my kids to have no baggage, because what kind of person would they turn out to be if there was literally no baggage at all, right? Like, we definitely want our children to grow up with a little bit of baggage. And I just thought that's actually such a good way of putting it, is that, it's really easy to yearn for an easy life, right? To yearn for a life that's like friction free and just full of pleasure and ease and all that kind of stuff. But actually, it doesn't, that kind of life doesn't turn out good, interesting people, I don't think, personally, or creative people.
No, I totally agree. And weirdly, I was actually thinking about this yesterday because I've been growing sunflowers, and I've been like, my life is just growing these sunflowers now. I've got a porch and I keep them in the porch. And then I was like, all the stalks have gone all spindly. And I was like, why are my precious baby sunflowers that I have protected with my entire life, why are the stalks so spindly? And it was because I hadn't put them outside, so they hadn't had a chance for the wind to blow on them. So the stalks had become weak because they hadn't had enough like resistance, and I was like, oh, but I thought I was protecting them, keeping them away from the wind, but actually I was just making them spindly, horrible little sunflowers that were too, like, I think they're like, do you know the Secret Garden, that little child, and I've basically done that with the sunflowers, so I'm having to.
It's just a life lesson in all of that, because we do want to protect, right? We do. And there are some things that I really do, probably to extremes because of our situation, to protect the kids because we're dealing with so many challenges. So I am definitely as much in the habit of doing that as any modern parent, for sure. But yeah, it's really interesting to be sort of slightly forced into quite a lot of friction. It's neither wholly good or wholly bad. And it is just sort of what it is. And I've thought for a long time, and it's what I wrote about in my first book, this idea of like, if you just resist, if you keep resisting and you keep trying to convince yourself that what you're experiencing is just wrong and shouldn't be, you're only going to be miserable. You'll just be miserable. And so, if we can accept that there are beautiful and awful parts of our life in this whatever package we've been handed in that we have no control over, acknowledge both of those things, we'll just be happier. We'll just be so much happier.
And is this something that you have got better at, or is it something that comes and goes, or is it something that you've got nailed, or something that you're working on? How is your relationship to that now?
Nailed. I would say it took a lot of practice, I would say, and it continues to be a practice. We had the morning I mentioned yesterday, there got a point yesterday morning that was very, very bad. And when I'm in those moments where essentially he is in complete fight or flight, and because I spend so much time regulating him, there's only so long I can regulate him before I then cannot regulate myself. And it is just a fact, unfortunately. As much as we do all the right things and look after ourselves and do all this, there are situations we get into that are really unsafe and frightening. And I cannot necessarily stay regulated the entire way through, unfortunately. And so I lost it at one point yesterday. And when I lose it, it's very easy to get in the spiral of, I cannot, there's no way I can keep doing this. But of course, you get through that moment, that half hour, hour, 2 hours, whatever it is. And my son got to school safely and he calmed down. He's actually very good at calming down after big events like that. Um, and then I had some time alone, and then actually ended up sitting down and writing and working on the project I'm writing at the moment. And, in that, suddenly I was in that flow state. And then when I had finished that writing session, I got up and I was a bit like, oh yeah, I've let it go now. Like I've let it go. Like in the moments when those really, really bad moments are happening, you are so in it, you can't see out of it at all. But then actually, an hour or two later, it's gone. And that's the thing I've got much better at, is not holding on to those really terrible moments. I can let them go. They still happen. I still feel scared, overwhelmed, um, frustrated, angry, all of those things in the moment. I still feel all those feelings as strongly as I did when he was like 3 or 4 years old and I was completely overwhelmed and had no support for him and nothing in place. I still feel all those same things I did then, but the difference is now I recover from them like right away, pretty much. Generally, I would say I'm really good at recovering now and in a way that I wasn't 10 years ago.
You were saying about your writing there. How have you managed to navigate the patriarchal structure of what writing should look like? You read Stephen King, you read all the books about writing, and it's all like, you have to get up, you have to write this amount of words a day, you have to, it has to look like this, you have to close your study door, you have to let everything go. And obviously, like, as a caregiver, and that's just not how your life can look, and yet you are writing really well. Like, you have created a practice for yourself. How do you close down that voice that's saying you're not doing it in the correct way?
Over the years, I've just had to listen to myself. I've had to learn to listen to myself and not to other people around me. Because the fact is, I love writing. I write because I enjoy it. I write because of that getting into that flow state. I write because it's how I process everything going on in the world around me. It's a pleasure to sit down and write. It's a joy. That doesn't mean it's always easy. Sometimes it's very difficult. I'm writing fiction now, and it is so much more challenging than nonfiction for me. But I still love it. I absolutely love it, and I'm going to keep doing it. For me, that is the difference. It's about me acknowledging that actually I'm doing it because it's what I want to be doing with my time. It's what I'm choosing to be doing with the time. I'm not doing it because there is nothing particularly disciplined about me, I would say. I know sometimes people look at my life from the outside and they think, I've got the kids on my own, I pay all the bills, I run a business and I write. And, with my son's needs as high as they are, and all of the challenges that come with that, including being very restricted about where I can go and where I can't go, having to now work from home. I already had to give up one career working outside of the home. And they think, oh, well, but Penny must be really disciplined then in order to get that stuff done. No, I'm not at all disciplined. I'm writing because I love it. I run my business so that I can pay all my bills, and I do really enjoy running my business. But in terms of my writing, even though I do earn money from my writing, it's not really, writing is not terribly well paid for most people. So it's not enough of a motivation, right? Really, the motivation is because of the incredible satisfaction and creative pleasure that I get from it. And so that's one thing I always am talking about with writers that I'm working with, is that we sometimes feel like, when it comes to like a creative practice like writing, that it's it's all about discipline, and it's all about showing up even if we don't want to, and about kind of cracking the whip on ourselves and punishing ourselves into doing something. And actually, I don't think it's that at all. It's about actually leaning into the joy and the pleasure of a creative practice, because you get so much out of the process. It's not just about having the finished product, although the finished, getting to the end is a deeply satisfying thing to happen, because you really feel a sense of accomplishment. But actually, the process of itself is so rewarding. And knowing and understanding what it is that you love about the process can really help you sit down and get the work done. I have really been able to throw a lot of things out the window when it comes to how I approach work and how I approach my life. Um, I feel like there is a lot that we think is compulsory in our culture, right? There's a lot of things that we think is compulsory for us to participate in as parents or as people in our 40s or whatever it is. And actually, what I found having a child who doesn't fit in with all of that has freed me up from it. For instance, a lot of my friends, when our children were younger in primary school, got very caught up in having to provide lots of enriching, activities for their children. Well, I have never been able to do that because it's sort of physically impossible to do that for my non-disabled child because of my disabled child's needs, and I'm only one person, and I couldn't do all the things that perhaps a typical family might expect to be able to do for their children. And what's interesting about that is that when you can't do what everyone assumes is kind of compulsory, um, you suddenly realize that almost nothing is compulsory. Like almost no way any one person lives their life is a compulsory way of doing it. I have to pay my bills. My children have certain, medical needs and administration needs that I need to fulfill, but actually most of everything else is not compulsory. And as soon as I was able to really acknowledge that, and my son really forced me to acknowledge that, actually it's incredibly freeing. It's so freeing.
You said a bit earlier that you did the right rope because you did it for yourself. And it sounds like there's been a couple of things that you said so far where it seems like you've got a really strong sense of self, of who you are, and I don't think everybody has that. Is this something that you've always had? Have you always been able to like commune with yourself, or is it something that you've developed through your writing, or is it a new thing, or is it just something that's intrinsic to who you are and how you relate to the world?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, I think a few things happened when I was a teenager that showed me that knowing what you need can make such an enormous difference to your life. When I was 14, my mum went through a really, really, really particularly bad year and attempted suicide a number of times that year. And it got to the point where I I didn't know how I was going to I didn't know how to keep functioning. Like I was worried that I would drown with her, basically. And in the end, actually, my dad lived in another country, and in the end, I had a conversation with him and said to him, I think I think I need to be in a boarding school. I don't think I can do this anymore. I don't think I can be here. And he listened, first of all, agreed, and then did the necessary thing to make it happen. And that absolutely saved me. It absolutely saved me. And I think it taught me, I didn't realize until much later, probably in my 30s, I didn't quite realize how important a moment that was in my life to be able to articulate to someone in a really vulnerable way what was going on and that I needed help. And help came. That was luck in many ways. Luck that my dad was willing to listen, obviously, but also that he could afford to do something about it. Like there was something he could do to physically help. But it taught me a really important thing, I think, about paying attention to what's going on in you and then trying something to change it, right? Like not doing the same thing over and over and over again, but like reaching out, asking for help, seeing if there was something different that could happen because it did totally change my life. It was a really, really important lesson. And I think I carried that on from then on, this idea of sometimes there is a solution, sometimes there is a better way. And so I think from then on, I was probably pretty good at reflecting on what it was that I might need in order to function. I think it probably then sort of got a bit more into an actual practice. In my 20s, I was living in New York, and but then I went into photography, and I was living in New York working for a fashion photographer, and I was there over 9/11. And um, afterwards, it was very difficult for all of my close friends and all of us, basically everyone in New York. It was like couldn't read, couldn't watch films, like everything was a struggle, right? Everyone was kind of in a state of shock afterwards for months afterwards. And the thing that got me kind of going again was my flatmate at the time. She was a writer, and she gave me a copy of The Artist's Way. And I started the practice in The Artist's Way, which I'm sure many listeners will know about, of morning pages and doing 3 pages of handwriting in the mornings. And I carried on that practice all the way through until I became a parent about 10 or so years after that. And that is where I became a little bit more, I guess, deliberate about reflecting on paper specifically about what it was that I needed. So yeah, so then I guess in my 20s, yeah, it solidified into a bit more of a practice. And then I don't do morning pages all the time now because my life is just a bit mental. But I do always turn to handwriting and a notebook and pen whenever I need to reflect. And I do that at least, even if I'm not doing it all the time, at least a good few times throughout the year. Or if anything is happening in my life that needs reflection, I will always turn to pen and paper to do that.
And what did your mornings look like in the boarding school?
Oh, it was all very easy, actually. God, comparing, like going from being in a home where, and, my mum and I were very, very, very close, and she was a gorgeous, warm, wonderful woman. But when she became very unwell, she was basically in bed and sort of behind closed doors, and that was it. And I would sometimes like barely see her for kind of weeks at a time, or otherwise I'd be there beside her bed consoling her. To go from that, where I was a teenager, where I was looking after myself, cooking for myself. No one was checking if I was doing homework. No one necessarily was checking if I was eating, all those sorts of things. To go to a boarding school, which I know some people probably think it must be a really difficult, rigid environment. I was cared for the first time in like a few years. And I felt like the structures and the support were there, that like people did notice if you didn't go to meals. You would get in trouble if you didn't go to meals. They're very, particularly in girls' houses. I felt sort of deeply cared for. So yeah, we had to go to breakfast. We had to get up. We had to be dressed. We had roll call, and then we had to go off to breakfast. But even though I was in boarding schools can make you quite independent in many, many ways, because you have to be in charge of your own laundry and all that kind of stuff. There is somebody serving you food 3 times a day. I mean, like, there is certainly many teenagers who are not getting that at home. And so, yeah, I felt kind of weirdly looked after in boarding school.
You said that you felt really cared for. What does being cared for look like to you?
I think it's like somebody noticing your needs, just somebody recognizing, first of all, that you have them, and noticing them, even if they're not necessarily doing everything for you or anything like that, but just somebody else noticing your needs. I think my husband and I don't live together. We've kept 2 places largely because of my son's really intense needs. Some people might be surprised about that. I think it works really, really well, but also I feel cared for all the time, not just the times that we're in the same house together. I feel very cared for by him. And I think that's a lot to do with just that being recognized by another person. That other person is just always there emotionally, even if they're not physically there.
And what would an ideal morning now look like for you?
Well, an ideal morning is always one where my son has slept all night long. Um, because there are nights where he does sometimes not sleep at all, like literally not at all. So an ideal morning would definitely follow a full night's sleep. Ideally, I would always want to be awake before everybody else, just to have some time alone, and to have some time to be me without yet having to be on and needed by somebody else. Absolutely. Always starts with a cup of tea. Always. And it's funny because like sometimes I love writing first thing in the morning. Sometimes I absolutely love it, and other times it's just nice to kind of do nothing. Um, Sometimes it's nice to alternate between those, to have some mornings where you're, really kind of get into your creative zone, and other mornings where you're kind of just allowed to be. Yeah, that is where it's ideal. There's just that sense of being able to be yourself without demands on you before the demands of the day begin. But in practical terms, really, yeah, it's just in an ideal world, it would just everything would go smoothly. It would just from then on, right? Everything would be like people just get up and do what they're supposed to do in the morning. And so I don't begin the day with like, I don't know, on the back foot. Yeah.
And what, how do you have your cup of tea?
Just with milk. But like, really strong tea, but also with quite a lot of milk as well.
And
Yeah.
what brought you to London?
It was really work because I did film and creative writing at university in Melbourne, and I decided over the course of those few years that I ended up wanting to get into photography. Um, and I had I have an English grandfather, or had an English grandfather, so a right to an ancestry visa, and basically I looked into it, and I was like, if I want to be a photographer, there's basically two places in the world that I can do that are English speaking, and that is London and that is New York. And that was it, basically. If I really wanted to do it, those were the two places I was going to have to do it. And so I moved to London.
Still do photography now?
No, I was a photographer for many, many years. I was an interiors photographer for about 15 years. It became impossible to work to do that work anymore. When you're a photographer, even though I was freelance, and people always assume being freelance is very flexible, but actually it's flexible to a certain extent, but then it becomes very rigid in that when I was booked for a job, I had to show up for that job no matter what, and I would have to be there at 9 a.m. And that might have been in Wales, or it might have been in West London, or it might have been in North London, or it might have been in Essex, whatever. And actually, I did for many years after I became a single parent, I still managed to do that. And I still, with like kind of, nannies, because my son always needed one-to-one care. He could never use any before or after school clubs. He was, first of all, not able to access them at the mainstream school he initially started at. And then he moved to a specialist school, and they don't have that kind of thing. They just don't even offer it. Most disabled children in this country have no access to any kind of care at all. So I gave up that career, and I had already written my first book when that happened, actually. And during that time of writing that book, because I'd spent more time at home while I was writing my first book, I was like, oh yeah, this is what I need. I need to be doing a work from home, because actually my stress levels came down. I was able to be much more responsive. I was less dependent on paid people who, of course, inevitably let us down. Not necessarily always to, for their own, like on purpose, illness, that kind of stuff. It became necessary for me to kind of change my life around to be able to meet his needs. And actually, lots of amazing things have come out of that. And I do have a career now that I really, really love. I still feel quite angry about how I was forced to do it because of, lack of services and lack of things in place for disabled children. But I have got a career that I really, really enjoy, and is much more flexible.
And a question that I always ask, if you were at a hotel buffet, a breakfast buffet, what is your strategy for a hotel breakfast buffet?
Ooh. I mean, I always a two course. It's got to be always be two courses. So usually it would be some kind of yogurt, granola, fruit type thing. You know what I always think whenever someone else is making you food, the thing that's nice to get is the thing that usually requires lots of different things. And fruit is one of those things, because like it all goes off in the fridge if you buy like five different kinds to put together at once. So usually I'll have just like strawberries or just raspberries or something like that in my fridge. So being able to go and have like a whole variety of fruit is so nice. And then, yeah, obviously followed by something hot, like, eggs on toast or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, it's got to be the two courses.
And if you've come to the end of your life and an angel comes or whatever you believe in, and it says to you, you're allowed to go back and you're allowed to have one more morning, where are you going in your life to have that one more morning?
Oh, well, I'd have to spend it with my mum, who died when I was 22. So I would go back to before she was unwell. So I would go back to probably my first childhood home, which we lived in until I was 11. I wrote about that home actually in my second book, Home Matters, and it's a home that just it was so special for so many different reasons. And the moment we left that home, everything changed for our family. And I would want to be there in that kitchen at Badger's Wood with my mum, with my brothers. Yeah, that would be amazing. I would love to go back to that time.
And paint it, let us imagine it. What does the kitchen look like?
Well, the thing that was so interesting is that because I was writing about it in Home Matters, when I went back to Australia, I actually, through friends of friends of friends, found out who owned the house and got in contact with them and asked if I could come and visit it. Because I wanted to go back and experience what it was like being in again. And so she was like, "Yeah, come on, come and see us." And so I went back to visit that childhood home just a couple of years ago. Um, it is my parents actually. It's a house that was built in the 1920s by one of Australia's first female land developers. She was a landscaped gardener, Edna Walling, who wrote many, many books about gardening and was like a big garden writer in Australia in the 20th century. Really was born in England but moved to Australia as a teenager. Really, over the course of her career, brought in a lot of native plants into and kind of combined it with a kind of sort of English cottage garden type thing. She designed all of the houses on this street and the gardens, and it was a really, really special place to live because it attracted people who were very specifically interested in her as a garden designer, and they were all gardeners basically. So all the people on the street were all very much there for the gardens. And my parents extended, because it was a tiny cottage originally, and they put an extension on, and the kitchen was part of that extension. But it white weatherboard the house with a tin roof, very Australian. But the kitchen had sort of cottage windows on three sides with a dining table in the middle of that. And then the kitchen was still exactly the same layout when I went back a few years ago, which was so amazing. Just like a very pine, very kind of very 80s, very pine kitchen, pine paneling, that overlooked the dining area and all of the windows around the outside. And obviously it was set in this incredible garden. And so you were just surrounded by gardens. And so it was very much a room that we spent a lot of time in. You know, it had the kind of slouchy sofa in the corner that the dogs were always sleeping on. And it's, you know, where I did my homework and where we ate every single meal and all that kind of stuff. It was very much the heart of the home, and had one of those like classic kind of pantries you could shut yourself in. And of course it was the 80s and 90s. And so we had a landline, and you could take the phone, the cord, into the pantry. So you could like sit in the pantry when you're on the telephone. It was a beautiful home to live in. And my mum was very much a homemaker. Like, she made it always the most incredible warm place to go back to. The door was always open, friends were always welcome. We constantly had friends over. Yeah, it was just a very, very, very happy home.
It sounds absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, Penny. This has been an absolutely gorgeous conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Before the Work Begins podcast with me, Jo Hutton. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you always get to hear the brand new episodes of this podcast. You can find me on Instagram at Jo Hutton Yoga, and of course on Substack at Yoga for Tired People.